Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Generous Futures, Unpacking Food Insecurity and Access. My name is Juniper Losalento. I am the Chief Development and Communications Officer for Community Food Centers Canada, and I'm also an instructor and course developer of the Fundraising Management Program in the Chang School at Toronto Metropolitan University. We're really excited about today's panel. It delves into an issue that is close to my heart and to the hearts of my fellow panelists today. And I'm really excited about the conversation that we're about to have. Before we start, I would like to begin with a land acknowledgement. TMU is located in the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bounds them to share the territory and to protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and newcomers, have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. I would also like to take an opportunity to thank our lead sponsor of this series, TD Bank Group, for helping to bring Generous Futures to all of you. We simply could not do this series without TD. And let's get started today. We're talking about food insecurity and the role of philanthropy. And we'll start out with a short definition. Food insecurity is defined as the inadequate or insecure access to food due to financial constraints. And from unprecedented lines at the grocery store during the early days of the pandemic to skyrocketing food inflation, food insecurity has entered the public consciousness like never before. Based on the latest data from 2022, 7 million Canadians cannot afford the food that they need, and 1 in 4 children in Canada face food insecurity. For those who want to dig into the data, you can visit proof.utoronto.ca. Proof is an interdisciplinary research project housed at U of T that looks specifically at food insecurity and policy interventions. And these numbers, according to Proof, are continuing to climb. Another important point, according to Proof, is that food insecurity is racialized. People who identify as white or not a visible minority have the lowest prevalence of food insecurity, and the highest percentage of individuals living in food insecure households in 2022 was found among Black people at 39.2% and Indigenous peoples at 33.4%. Recent conversations about food security are beginning to look at the wider issues of injustice, of poverty, and systemic inequity. And the question, what role does philanthropy play in shifting these narratives from food access to equity? So our conversation today will explore the role of philanthropy in shifting those narratives and putting equity at the forefront. So the plan we have for the next 45 minutes is pretty straightforward. I'll be introducing our 3 esteemed panelists. We'll hear from each of them and we'll engage in some conversation. And I'll do my best to get to some of the questions that were pre-submitted before registration. So without further ado, I'm delighted to introduce you to our panel. And our first panelist is Janine Manning. Janine is Anishinaabe, and she's a member of the Chippewas of Nawash First Nation. She's the manager of annual giving and donor relations at the Anishinaabe Health Foundation, and she's also the chair of the Laidlaw Foundation, and she's a consultant to various organizations. Janine has dedicated the last decade to Indigenous relations, to community development and revitalization efforts through public granting, private trust, and philanthropy, and the charitable sector. She is an Indigenous advisor to the City of Toronto, to the Toronto Public Library, as well as to BGC Canada. And Janine is a passionate, community-centric fundraiser, grant maker, and a trust-based philanthropic leader. Welcome, Janine.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for that introduction.
Next, we have Ava Dana Sefa. And Ava is a business and public policy professional with extensive experience working across the private, public, and nonprofit sectors at organizations including the World Bank and CPP Investments. In her current role as Vice President Social Impact at Generation Capital, Ava manages the philanthropic and impact investing activities of 2 foundations as well as individual clients. She is passionate about applying market-based approaches to addressing pressing social issues, and also serves as a board director for the Toronto Foundation, as well as Options for Homes. Welcome, Ava Dana.
Thank you so much.
And lastly, we have Laura Errol. Laura is the managing director of the Errol Family Foundation, which works to improve human and planetary health through food. Laura has been a director of her family foundation for many years, and she's been leading it since 2015. And prior to working at the foundation, Laura worked at the U.S. investment bank Raymond James as managing director, U.S. equity sales. She's mother to 3 children and passionate about cooking, food, and travel. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks very much.
So what we are going to do here is we're going to start out with a stage setting question. So I'll be asking the same question to each of you. And Laura, I'll invite you to answer first, followed by Ava and then Janine. And this will be kind of a shorter intro, and then we'll dig deeper into some of the areas of expertise that each of you offer. So from your perspectives and your experience, why is it so important to talk about food security and philanthropy at this particular time? Laura?
Thanks, Juniper. And hello to everyone. Thanks for joining this really important conversation today. I think as you were talking about, Juniper, I mean, we all see as we walk, in our neighborhoods these days, the lineups at food banks, and clearly COVID and now the rising, cost of inflation, rise in food costs. It's really created a ridiculously disgusting crisis situation at our food banks. And I think noticeably, as you said, the amount of people who are actually employed who are using food banks for the first time in their lives. Also, the really grave increase in children who are also relying on food banks as a primary source of nutrition is just, a real change from the past. I think with philanthropy, there is a real opportunity to have a sort of non-corporate perspective in using our collective voice and in using our resources to advocate for change in this area, because the current situation is not going away, it's getting worse, and something clearly needs to be done. And that has led us in the direction of sort of government, advocacy work.
Thank you very much. Ava, would you like to answer?
Sure, I fully agree with everything that Laura mentioned. Juniper, thank you so much for highlighting all of the sort of issues connected to food insecurity at the top of the webinar. I think it's important now for philanthropy because there's a lot of momentum. We've seen how the issues were exacerbated significantly during the COVID-19 pandemic. So for everybody that was not well versed in how these issues affect marginalized communities, that was front and center. So I think this is the moment to sort of move forward, capitalize on the momentum that we've seen, and actually create change. And I think for philanthropy in particular, I really do believe in the concept of philanthropic capital being risk capital and enabling funders to get out, trying new ideas, supporting different organizations to create new solutions to a problem that has been pressing for decades.
Thank you. Janine?
Yeah. Why is food insecurity? So this is such a huge question, and I agree with my panelists. I would also like to add that, right now, and probably we could have started paying a little bit more attention to climate change and, the harsh realities that are going to come with climate change in exasperating food insecurity. And that conversation about food access to land and waterways to continue, food sources for folks has to happen in conjunction, with the climate change conversation. So I'm very hesitant to promote philanthropy and filling the gaps which the government should be filling themselves. I think we know that when food banks were created, this kind of framed food as charity and almost relieved the government of a lot of the responsibilities they had to citizens in ensuring access to food security, and also food as a human right. And so I would say that, philanthropy has a role in not just, funding food banks or funding charities, but funding innovative solutions, especially in a period of climate change, to create better access, but also advocacy. We know that the network of foundations in this country is very strong. We have the ear of the government and ability to advocate on behalf of people trying to solve food security issues. So I would say that it's not just about money, it's also about advocacy and kind of holding the government accountable to their responsibilities to citizens in regards to food access and security.
Thanks, Janine. And I want to add one point that touches on something that each of you mentioned, and particularly Ava, when you talked about the changes. What's really interesting when you dig into the data is you see that food insecurity declined during the pandemic, and that's specifically because of CERB. So when you're talking about what is the answer to food insecurity, as you've all mentioned, the question of the role of government, the role of advocacy, and putting more money into the pockets of low-income Canadians to enable them to make their own choices. CERB showed us that food insecurity can decline when that happens. And that is, obviously that was an unintended impact of CERB, but something that is important. And certainly many in the sector are looking at that as we look at what are those long-term solutions. So now we're going to jump to digging in even deeper, and I'm going to invite Janine to come to the fore next. And Janine, your leadership across the sector, we talked a little bit about that in your bio. You've brought forward critical issues that address equity and justice, especially for Indigenous peoples. And I want to invite you to share with us, why is it important to challenge traditional philanthropic practices as part of a commitment to truth and reconciliation?
I only have 3 minutes, right? Yeah, so I guess I will begin by saying that food insecurity, although we see it rising, is nothing new to Indigenous folks. This has been imposed upon us since colonization and the removal of our access to waterways and lands and the ability to provide for ourselves. So in that way, when folks are in the philanthropic sector are thinking of ways in which, they can reconcile with Indigenous folks and foster the, reconciliation project, think about what historically has been imposed upon Indigenous folks, and how does that contribute to, common experiences today of food insecurity. And we know that food insecurity does not happen in a bubble, that it's driven by poverty, homelessness, unemployment, in the economy, inflation, all these things we know and we've just discussed, but it's also driven by race and colonization. And those who, we need to have an equitable approach to folks who are so extremely marginalized that this is a normal way almost of living for them. And so I think we have to really be conscious that this isn't everyone's experiencing it, in the same way or for the same reasons. We need to be conscious of that segregated data of how, food insecurity affects folks by region, by community, because urban Indigenous folks are experiencing different types of food insecurity compared to those who are living in the north or more remote areas farther from the city. And so you want to repeat the question again, because I can go off.
Well, I mean, that was great context. I think you answered the question. The question I asked you was why is it important to challenge traditional philanthropic practices? And I think what you gave us a lot of important context, which needs to be thought about when we're thinking about how do you, quote, solve food insecurity. You have to understand what are the factors that led us to this place, particularly the factors and the impacts of colonization.
So one thing I would add there is that traditionally in philanthropy, what we have are donors or philanthropic organizations and leadership prescribing ways in which they believe food insecurity can be solved. And I know, as far as Indigenous communities goes, is that it's not, it's not usually Indigenous folks who are in those decision rooms who are deciding on, how to allocate funds. And so I would say we cannot afford to be prescriptive and thinking, in the way that traditional philanthropy is. I would, advise people to contact communities and work with them, work with Indigenous advisors, Indigenous consultants, and, support groups, not groups, but organizations like the Circle, formerly known as the Circle of Philanthropy and Indigenous People, to help them to facilitate a really meaningful relationship with those that they want to support through food insecurity.
Thank you. We're going to turn to Ava next. And Ava, we're going to talk a little about social impact, which is obviously a term we hear all the time. It can be defined in many different ways. One of the foundations under your umbrella is the Balsam Foundation. And I wonder if you can share with us how that foundation's commitment to social impact has informed your granting focus, which includes community well-being and food security.
For sure. As you mentioned, social impact is a very broad term, and a lot of different people have a lot of different interpretations of it. But for us at Balsam Foundation, it really is informed by our research on integrated community care and social determinants of health. And from conversations that we have with our community partners and just observations in the media, our research process, it's clear that the health systems and food systems in Canada are not operating properly. There are so many people that continue to be left behind more and more as time passes. And it's clear that there's a gap. And what individuals who are responsible for managing those systems believe is required, but and what communities actually need are not speaking to each other. So I think for us at Balsam Foundation, it really does come down to the idea and the focus on placing capital with organizations that are working to address these issues with a community-based approach. So wanting to make sure that we're dedicated partners and engaging in a way that amplifies those voices, and to Janine's earlier point, not prescribing what we believe the answer should be, because we do not have expertise in understanding the nuances of different community needs. So I think it really is a process in active partnership and active engagement. And I think that all manifests into our definition of social impact. And we try and put it into practice every day when we're working with the folks that are at the table with us.
Thank you. And Laura, I'm going to turn to you now also to talk about impact. And in this case, from the perspective of your family foundation, as we shared, the mission of your family foundation is improving human and planetary health through food. And when you're thinking about your philanthropic investments, can you tell us about the impact that you strive to have in those areas?
Yes, sure. So I think, as Janine said, if you care about the future of our planet, you have to care about where our food comes from and how it's produced, because, the connection there is undeniable. I think, luckily, it's on the front page. It's finally kind of getting the attention of the public at large. I also think, the connection between food and what you put in your body and your mental and physical outcomes are, there's an undeniable question there. I mean, we all know that we have more than enough food in the world. It's really a question of access and equity, and ultimately sometimes just logistics that comes down. And we certainly see that, in the North and in Canada, and the populations that were very vulnerable during COVID. So I think, through our work, we're doing a lot to advocate. Again, I think we, as was mentioned earlier, I think philanthropic capital is a great form of risk capital. We can afford to go out and try and prove to the government some programming, some put together measurement and evaluation to support some of the initiatives that we are, and really use our voice as a foundation to try and advocate for change. So we're doing that, for things like social prescribing right now, that I know is something that CFCC cares about, for income supports more broadly, housing, affordable housing, and I mean, most importantly, what I've been working passionately on is a national school food program in the last year, because I feel like that is just such an easy way to get a good, nutritious meal into every student in Canada. So working hard on things like that.
Thank you. And I think it's worth pointing out that we all recognize the complexity of the issues and that there can be interventions that can have an immediate impact and ones that can have a medium-term impact and ones that can actually start to get at the underlying systemic issues, and that you need a combination of all of those things in order to move the dial forward. So Janine, I'm going to come back to you, and I know you have a lot to say, so we're really picking up on where you left off. So as you know, the conversations in the sector are starting to evolve beyond a charitable response to food insecurity and other related issues into addressing systemic issues. And so what do you see as the need for our sector to really advance that work and really embrace and address the challenges of addressing colonization and addressing structural racism? And so what do you want to see specifically from the nonprofit and charitable sector? And you're muted.
Of course I am. That is a huge question. I don't think one that I could cover. I definitely have some thoughts on systems change, and I don't know if colonial structures or can be fully decolonized. I think there is a lot of space for more inclusion of Indigenous people, voices, and other people of color and Black folks, because we are, the philanthropic sector is very dominated by white settlers. There is a history of where a lot of this wealth comes from. And frankly, a lot of it has come from stolen land and stolen labor. So I'm a big advocate on decolonizing wealth, creating bigger pathways for access to wealth beyond, charitable programming. All the job fairs in the world are not going to solve the unemployment that, marginalized people experience, right? There's so much more at play. So I think we really need to be more representative of folks who are experiencing the issues and the systems that we want to change. Speaking specifically about the philanthropic sector, that starts with leadership. And so majority of philanthropic organizations in this country are family foundations, and not a lot of Black Indigenous folks are on those board of directors. There's not a lot of public calls to participate in that way. They're very private and don't welcome many public, seats for governance seats. So I would say starting, let's start internally, as folks in the philanthropic sector, and really look at ourselves and how we govern. Do we represent the communities that we are trying to work in partnership with? That speaks volumes, and I think will move forward your work just by being inclusive and representative and diverse. And then I would say that those folks who are living with and experiencing those systems really need to be leading those conversations. And there's tools and resources that we can support as governance leaders and folks with access to wealth in, in a backseat way. Right? We can convene people, we can offer capacity supports, open up avenues for networking and mentoring and access to people who are making those decisions that affect our lives so deeply. So a lot of relationships, systems change work is really dependent on relationships and having the right players in the right places. But yeah, decolonization is a huge issue. When we live in a colonial world, in a colonial reality, but there are definitely people that are there to support if people are willing to change. And again, I would say, just like with building granting programs or, trying to determine where you should be allocating or redistributing wealth, make sure that those folks are consulted as advisors and brought into the conversation early on. Not as a final step to approve what you think is going to be great work.
Thank you. I was thinking about, at the earlier part of your remarks, you were talking about the makeup of boards, and certainly within operating charities as well, that's come up. And Senator Ratna Omidvar has spearheaded some work for us for some transparency around what do boards of charities look like right now. And we know that we need some of that baseline data in order to start making some of the changes that you've talked about to become a more inclusive sector.
For sure.
Okay, thank you. We're going to turn to Ava. And Ava, you had in your previous response, you talked a little bit about social determinants of health. And so maybe you can just explain to all of us, just high level, what they are and how they play into informing an effective, or can play into informing an effective philanthropic giving strategy.
Yeah, no big deal. Social determinants of health, just go.
101.
So for us with Balsam Foundation and our granting practices, social determinants of health has been a very helpful lens and sort of framework to understand the building blocks of health within the communities in which we live. And it is eye-opening once you really start digging into the research. And it really is true, the adage within the social determinants of health sort of research community is that your health is more likely determined by your postal code than your genetic code. And it is stark when you start to understand individuals in low-income communities, marginalized communities, individuals from racialized backgrounds, how adverse and how scary the health outcomes can be. And food insecurity and food access is a huge component of that. It's always so frustrating to me personally to hear all of these conversations about people need to make healthier food choices, but communities often aren't constructed with access to a healthy food in, a particular region or a particular zone. And they're sort of front loaded with, more affordable options that aren't necessarily the healthiest or more the most nutritious. And then we wonder why we have all these higher rates of diabetes and all sorts of diseases that are directly attributed to the quality of the food that we have access to. So I think for us as funders, it's helpful in a few ways. One, it opens us up to thinking more holistically about health overall. I think sometimes there can be conversations within the philanthropic sector around, health is hospital, health is acute care, not health is all around us. And I think the social determinants of health framework really underscores that. I think it also allows us to avoid linear thinking when it comes to funding and partnership opportunities. It's not this 500,000 will achieve this outcome when it comes to health and food insecurity. It's about how does this map onto all of these other issues at play, and how do we sort of contend with all of those through our partnerships. And I think finally, it allows us to adopt more of a systems-based thinking approach when it comes to partnerships and the power of the capital that we bring to bear. And I think that's quite powerful when we start with the idea of all of these different puzzle pieces that make up somebody's health, all of these puzzle pieces that connect to food security and achieving that. it forces us to think more broadly about who are the players that actually need to be at the table and how can we make sure everybody's present to actually create solutions.
One of the things that strikes me that's come up a few times in terms of thinking about philanthropic strategy and impact, and that it seems that there's been a shift in the sector to move away from this very, as you said, like this, we support health, we support this, and this much broader, more systemic approach, understanding that there are all of these interconnected factors, represented by social determinants of health, but also, again, how do you talk about anything in 2023 without talking about climate change? And as a fundraising professional, it's interesting to reflect on the sector's maturity in that space. And I remember, Ava, when I came to you and said, do you want to be on this panel? You said, well, just to be clear, we don't identify as funders of food security. And I think that does speak to a shift and an approach that is more holistic. Laura, I see you nodding. Do you want to jump into that?
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I mean, I think we do have sort of a fairly singular focus on food, but what I love about food is it allows you to go in so many different directions, whether it's regenerative agriculture, whether it's food waste, whether it's, again, advocating for the connection between food and health. It really allows you, or in our case, Janine, like it's been a good segue into, food insecurity in the North. It's been a big focus of ours as well. So I think that it's a very specific topic to focus on, but you can take it in so many different directions, which is great.
Thank you. And Ava, thank you again for that explanation too. So you totally handled social determinants of health in under 3 minutes or less.
Yeah, everybody on the call is an expert, thanks to me, I guess, right? Everyone?
Yeah. So Laura, I'm going to come to you. And we're taking a little bit of a turn here because we're talking, about, again, philanthropy as a bit of an ecosystem. And one of the questions that, is emerging that I feel somebody like you as the managing director of your family foundation, you're at the center of this. And this is, how do you make philanthropic decisions within an intergenerational family? And how do you align giving interests across generations? And how do you work through some of those challenges? So we would love to know, from your perspective, what are some of the differences that you see within your own family about the inclination to support different aspects of the food issues that fit into your mission?
Well, that's a sensitive topic, but it's a challenge. It can be a challenge. But I think going back to the comments I just said about food, the nice thing is everybody can pick what point, they want to come in to the conversation on that. My parents, for instance, are very interested in agriculture. So the whole, changing the way we do our farming system, or they're very interested in hospitals. So we've been doing a lot of work trying to get better food that follows the Canada Food Guide into hospitals. So, and then, the younger generation, I guess, probably maybe has a more optimistic attitude about the ability to advocate for change and to not let government off the hook for paying for some of these things that social supports that I think are needed. And just the belief that we can really change the status quo, I think would be, something we found in our family. I think, I think there's a general attitude of younger generations that equity and access is a bigger issue. People do not choose ever to go to a food bank. There's reasons people are there, and let's look deeper at the problems. Because food banks are, well needed, but they're more of a Band-Aid type solution, and we really need to look at the underlying issues. So I think that's something I feel like the younger generation is really, they're angry. It's on the front page of our news. People want to change the status quo. And so, we've definitely had some heated conversations around our boardroom table. But, it's consensus, right? And I think, like anything, education trying to educate different generations on the underlying issues, meeting people with lived experience. That's a very powerful tool to onboard people. So I think, we've tried to network, educate, and that's really been our sort of keys for success. But really, I mean, it all comes together around our boardroom of sort of shared values and the responsibility of giving back and making change. And yeah, so I think values and really your moral principles, help with this work.
Thank you for giving us a little bit of that inside view. Janine, we're going to come back to you. You had referenced earlier food sovereignty, and I wonder, again, a little like Ava with her Cole's notes on social determinants of health. What would you like this audience of 100 or so folks to know about Indigenous foodways and Indigenous food sovereignty, and why it's so important in the context of honoring Indigenous identity?
Yeah, so I will admit I'm not an expert in the food sovereignty area. I will say that food is a very important part of many Indigenous nations' culture. And it all ties to the land and our ability to be on land, access waterways, so that we can catch, hunt, pick our traditional foods and keep that culture alive. And so, just like many other things in our lives that have been affected by colonization, residential school, and other harmful government programs and interventions in our lives, we see post reconciliation an attention on the need to support Indigenous communities and charities. I'd like it to see a little bit more deeper, so that we're not just supporting the not-for-profit charity who has a food bank in their back room, but we're supporting Indigenous folks at the grassroots level who are addressing issues of culture, land base, food, pathways, waterways, revitalization and access to, so that we can, address these social determinants of health, not just through the access of food, but also the effect that the food has on our bodies. Indigenous folks have the highest rates of diabetes in Canada, and this is because of the imposed, starches, sugars, salts, carbs that colonization and the removal of our land caused. So there are folks out there who are doing work in trying to relearn and revitalize and share these traditional practices of food access, and that in itself is sovereignty. When you can control your own food, when you can have access to your own Indigenous diet, that is an empowering thing, and it breaks down so much barriers and really builds people, builds nations up. So I would encourage folks in the philanthropic sector to really do the homework and see who are the champions in the Indigenous food sovereignty spaces, and to look at how their power, privilege, and access to wealth and resources can be put to use in that area of access, revitalization, and sovereignty.
Thank you. So you did amazing. It was very compelling. And when we were chatting the other day in a prep call, I had mentioned the title. Darren Walker, who's the president of the Ford Foundation, had a book recently, and he talked about philanthropy moving from generosity to justice. And I feel like in what you just described, and the right for Indigenous people to have access to country foods and have food sovereignty, it tips to that moving beyond, I'd like to feel good, and to actually doing what is right. And so it's exciting to see the philanthropic sector starting to ask itself those hard questions and move in that direction. Ava, we're going to come back to you, and we're going to talk a bit about partnerships. And I know that's something that you're really passionate about. So when we're thinking about systemic issues, how do we bring together players from different sectors, whether that's public, private, community? And if you have an example of bringing those pieces together to drive forward change and address some systemic issues?
For sure. I think it connects into what you're just mentioning, Juniper, about moving from generosity to justice. It's making sure that partnerships that are using philanthropic funding are reflective of society or the communities in which they seek to create change. I think it's quite easy from a funding perspective to be able to prescribe what you think could work really well in a community. And because organizations require funding, they're often backed into a corner and just want to execute the will of the funder to be able to move forward in the work that they want to do. And I think it's really, really important for individuals who are at the table representing foundations to think more holistically about who is required to be at the table and how can we all get them there. And we, with Balsam Foundation, we kind of like this idea of like kind of like third representation. So like third government, third private, third community, government, or other folks can be part of it as well. But that's just like a general way that we like to think about how is this project or how is this collaboration comprised. And that, I think, bakes in accountability as well. Everybody at the table is keeping each other honest in a particular sense, and everybody at the table has their particular expertise that they can lend. For Balsam Foundation, Children's Aid Foundation of Canada, we've been working with them for a long time on child welfare prevention. That requires a big commitment from community organizations that work with families that find themselves interfacing with the care system. The government who dictates the funding mechanism for children's aid societies, and then private individuals or private foundations that provide the funding to be able to move forward and test out these projects and support the organizations in trying to engage the families as they are. So that's sort of like the larger scale example that I have. But I know Community Food Centers of Canada, our partnership with your organization, it's really exciting to see that come to bear as well with the advocacy component, engaging governments around food insecurity as well. I think sometimes it can be a little intimidating for some funders because these projects are longer term and can evolve and require sort of keeping on your toes, but having a strategy and a vision at the same time. But it is, I feel like, one of the main pathways to actually get to the place that we actually want to get to as a society, which is addressing these deep-seated issues and creating better outcomes for everyone.
Thank you. One thing that struck me, I have sort of a follow-up question for you. When you're talking about being in partnership with other entities, I wonder, there's a lot of conversation about the power that funders hold and how funders wield that power. And as you were describing the partnership, it struck me that the foundation is trying to lessen its impact and equalize it with other partners. Is that accurate?
Yeah, it's if we're really trying to have a justice orientation with this work, addressing the inherent power dynamics and funding relationships is paramount, and it comes up in a very insidious ways. It's not just somebody standing up saying, I'm in charge and you have to do what I say. It is baked into a lot of the different, as Janine was mentioning before, just the basic functions of the charitable sector. So I think it's very important for funders to take a step back and think about how we're actively dismantling those things. Part of that is, how closely are we listening to our community partners? How are we showing up as kind of allies and advocates for them in spaces where they can't, have access to? And that sometimes looks like us taking a little bit of a step back, but it also, I think, enables us to kind of express our partnership and support in different ways. Like you were saying before, it's not just about the money. So I think, yeah, it's a constant learning process, and we like to have like open dialogues with our partners, but it can get like weird sometimes. And it's important for it to, for everybody to work through it, but it's a big part of the whole process, I think.
Thank you. My last question in this part is for you, Laura, and it's a bit of it follows on this because it's around this idea, this sort of buzzword of trust-based philanthropy and equitable partnerships between foundations and charitable organizations. And Laura, I wonder if you have any advice for other philanthropists and foundations who are looking to build trust-based relationships. How have you approached those, and what's important to you in building those relationships?
Thanks. Well, I would actually sort of echo a bit of what Ava was saying there, that I think it's how we show up. We're not only financial backers. What other resources can we bring to the table? I think we have strong networks that we can bring in. I think that we can, be a connector, be a convener. There's other ways. I mean, I love co-funding with other people. Sort of forming coalitions. I mean, it's, it can be lonely work in some ways because you're sort of working away, it's what feels like a bit in a silo on your own. So it's really great to partner with other foundations and come together and support around a shared cause. But I think, whether you're in the public space or in the private space, it's really all about leadership. And I think that any organization we support, we always agree if it has a strong leader, and you've got to trust that leader, right? As Janine was mentioning before, I mean, people in community know what their needs are. People running an organization know what their needs are. I, as a funder coming in, might have an idea of what outcomes I'd like to, realize from the relationship, but it's not up to me to tell them, nor is it up to me to prescribe what I would like the outputs to be. And I think that there can be a lot of unrealistic reporting requirements that foundations can impose on organizations. And I think, again, you got to trust the leader. You got to trust that they know where the money you're giving them is best spent. So we tend to do most of our funding unrestricted, and we tend to do most of it multi-year because you need to have that visibility, I think, for the organizations to feel that their hands aren't tied. They've got the freedom to focus on what they need to do and to, achieve the outcomes that they know are what's needed to address the issue they're trying to solve.
Any fundraiser listening is applauding for you very loudly right now, Laura.
Well, I remember actually with CFCC, I think it was when I first started working with the organization, it was like 95% or something of all funds, I was told, were restricted. And I mean, I was just shocked because all the training I've done to how to be sort of a good worker in this space would tell you to do unrestricted. I mean, you've got to trust the organization you're supporting. And vice
Absolutely. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, and vice versa. It's a two-way partnership, right? And that's how I view it. It is, and I always, I don't even call them grants that we're making. I call them investments because you're investing in the organization and you're investing in finding a solution with them.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. So we have time for one audience question. I'm going to pose it to all of you, and whomever would like to jump in on it, we're pretty, I think, happy to share the floor. We've been thinking about food insecurity in a lot of different frames and talking about it in different frames, certainly clearly going beyond hunger, which is often at the base how people will think about it. And so I think that the question is this a public health issue? And how, if we thought about it as a public health issue, would that change our response, either philanthropically or more broadly in terms of government intervention? Anybody who wants to jump in on that one is welcome to unmute. Laura?
I think absolutely it's a public health issue. I mean, the connection, as I spoke to earlier, between food and health is undeniable. And if you can keep someone well nourished, you have a shot at keeping them off dialysis, which costs our system in Canada a hell of a lot of money. And unfortunately, we have a preventative, or not a preventative, we have a treatment-based healthcare system. And I think there's a lot of efficiencies of scale that could be realized if we actually viewed it, this other way. That if people are well nourished, they are going to be healthier, and that is going to save our system a lot of money and lead to a lot of other better outcomes, like improved GDP, productivity generally.
Thank you. I don't know, Ava and Janine, which of you unmuted first? So maybe Ava will go to you next, and then Janine, you get the last word.
Okay, yeah, I think Janine was first, but I'll slip in quickly and just say that I think connecting food insecurity to a public health issue, I think, is really important, not only for, to reflect the reality of the issue, but also to increase credibility and visibility of the issue. I find that when communities themselves say we have a food insecurity issue, they're not often heard. But when, health networks and hospitals and physicians say that health outcomes are directly attributed to food insecurity, people start listening. So I think in order to highlight the visibility of this issue, it's important to connect that to public health.
Thank you. And Janine?
Oh, I absolutely agree. I actually fundraise for a Indigenous health center, and so much of the health complications or challenges that a lot of our clients and community members face is directly based on, access to food and healthy food. We can run all the cooking classes in the world, but if they don't have the money, to go and buy that food, then, what good is that knowledge? I just wanted to kind of share an anecdotal story. Like I know you had mentioned earlier, Juniper, about how CERB, supported folks, and access on food banks was down and stuff like that. In a similar vein, a lot of Indigenous organizations accessed COVID funding to address food insecurity brought on through the public health crisis during the pandemic. And for a couple of years, we're able to offer clients food gift cards. Many Indigenous organizations turned into like food banks where they were creating their own food hampers and delivering them to clients. I know that we were doing that in Anishinaabe Health. Well, that funding has ran out. So those folks who were monthly, accessing $100 or $200 additional funds to support their food, their food bill, or accessing a hamper if they could not leave the house to go shop, they now do not have that support. And so I think that really speaks to the need for like a guaranteed income supplement for lower income folks. And, I recently at the Reconnect conference hosted by Community Foundations Canada and Toronto Foundation last week, learned about a philanthropic partnership with the YMCA, actually in my area. I'm in Owen Sound, and the Grey Bruce Community Foundation, with actually donations from Laidlaw Foundation and other family foundations, are supporting this pilot project with the YMCA, where they're supporting homeless youth between 16 and 24 to support them with an income supplement and also a rent supplement, so that they can live, healthier, more independent lives, and hopefully, have more food security and stable housing. So I thought, what a beautiful partnership. And as Laura was saying, they are in a position to run, risks, to do these tests on and to, track the data and the outcomes, to promote, the outcomes or positive impacts of guaranteed income in areas like food and rent. So I think, we really have to look at the issue of food insecurity holistically, and all the intersectionalities that come with the folks who are experiencing food insecurity.
That is definitely coming across loud and clear. And that leads us into just our last few minutes. because I need to leave room at the end to do a bit of thank yous, I'll just ask you one last question. And if you can all just keep it to 1 or 2 sentences, what is the takeaway? So we've got 100 people here listening to us, watching us attentively, no doubt. And what are the 1 or 2 things that you really want them to walk away with as they're thinking about perhaps challenging assumptions they may have had about food insecurity and the issues that we've talked about and the role of philanthropy in making a change in this overall system? So again, whoever wants to jump in first with their final takeaways, just unmute and go ahead, and we'll go from there.
I'm still off mute, so I'll just go ahead and jump in. I think there was so many amazing takeaways. I'm hearing loud and clear, though, that we need to relinquish power in the philanthropic sector and have a lot of trust and faith in those experiencing systems challenges, and also sharing the wealth, not just on a program level, but right to down to the grassroots, right into the hands of the folks that need it the most. Miigwech.
Thank you, Ginny.
I think, food is a human right. We all agree that. No one could argue otherwise. And I think people need to use their collective voices and come together and speak up about this human rights issue. It is a healthcare issue. It is a crisis situation. And I think the more media attention we can get on this, the more we can come together and as a community demand change. The government will listen if we speak loud enough.
Thank you, Laura. Ava?
I would just say I fully agree with Janine and Laura, and I would just say also that it's all a part of holistic health and prosperous communities. It all comes down to that. If we don't have the food insecurity piece solved, we will never be able to achieve that outcome. So I think it's imperative that everybody educate themselves more, start thinking, start engaging, and understanding how they can be part of actually creating a meaningful change.
Thank you so much to Ava, Laura, and Janine. This has just been such a thought-provoking hour of conversation. I trust that all of the folks listening and watching have enjoyed it. I really enjoyed it as well. And you all have such strong, clear perspectives. And just to be able to bring together a group of women to talk about this issue and bring forth their perspectives has been really wonderful. So thank you all. Again, I do want to thank our lead sponsor, TD Bank Group. We're truly grateful for your leadership in underwriting this series, and also promotional partners who help get the word out. And that is Canadian Association of Gift Planners, Canada Helps, Imagine Canada, and Community Foundations of Canada. And I just wanted to say to everybody, thank you for taking time out of your day to learn and engage with a topic that is very much top of mind for Canadians. And I hope that you have a great rest of your day and that you're inspired to take action. Thank you all.